The force feels mystical until power enters the room. As long as it remains an energy field binding the galaxy together, it is philosophy. It is meditation. It is personal growth. But the moment that same force influences decisions that affect millions of beings, it becomes political. And when it becomes political, it becomes dangerous. Because morality in isolation is abstract. Morality attached to governance carries consequence. In Star Wars, the Force does not exist in a vacuum. It collides with institutions. And when it does, myth transforms into warning. The saga has never truly been about singular heroes swinging lightsabers in isolation. It has always been about institutions rising, calcifying, and collapsing under their own contradictions. The Republic does not fall because one Sith is clever. It falls because its systems erode. The Jedi do not perish because they lack skill. They perish because they become entangled in state power. The Empire does not crumble because of a single explosion. It crumbles because centralized authority overextends. Heroes and villains are responses to structures. They do not replace them. They reveal them. Palpatine's genius is not lightning. It is legislation. Villains become terrifying when they understand that law can be weaponized more efficiently than lasers. A coup is dramatic. It shocks. It rallies resistance. But a democracy that votes itself into tyranny leaves citizens complicit. It leaves applause in the chamber. It leaves signatures on official decrees. That is why Palpatine endures as one of fiction's most unsettling antagonists. He wins legally. And legality blurs outrage. It converts horror into procedure. Politics grounds the fantasy. Starships are spectacle. Lightsabers are mythic. But trade routes determine prosperity. Emergency powers determine liberty. Committee votes determine whether clones march or diplomats negotiate. When laws change, consequences ripple through millions of lives. Suddenly the galaxy feels lived in. Decisions feel heavy. The stakes expand beyond dual outcomes. A destroyed Death Star is cinematic. A Senate voting to suspend civil protections is chilling. Because one is explosive. The other is familiar. The Jedi are at their most compelling not when they are invincible warriors, but when they are politically compromised. Peacekeepers forced into state service expose fault lines within the order. Can a spiritual institution serve a government without being consumed by it? Can guardians of balance command armies bred for obedience without absorbing that moral stain? Politics does not weaken the Jedi narratively. It sharpens them. It reveals blind spots. It forces confrontation with complexity rather than comfort in myth. The best Star Wars understands that oppression is structural. In Andor, tyranny is not delivered through monologues about unlimited power. It is delivered through paperwork, surveillance grids, labour quotas, bureaucratic indifference. That is why resistance feels desperate and human. Because it emerges not from prophecy, but from suffocation. When oppression is embedded in policy rather than personality, rebellion becomes survival rather than spectacle. Political storytelling removes clean victories. It replaces them with trade-offs. Every triumph costs something. Every compromise stains someone. When Mon Mothma maneuvers through Senate chambers, she sacrifices personal stability for long-term strategy. When Luthen Rael orchestrates insurgency, he forfeits moral clarity for momentum. The battlefield expands beyond physical terrain into ethical terrain. And ethical terrain is messy. That messiness is where tragedy deepens. Hope becomes more powerful when it confronts reality rather than evil archetypes. A farm boy defeating a Sith Lord is mythically satisfying, but a movement surviving censorship, fear, and propaganda feels earned. Hope in political Star Wars is not naive optimism. It is stubborn endurance. It exists within compromise, within loss, within systems designed to extinguish it. That kind of hope does not shine brightly at first. It flickers. And that flicker feels more human than destiny fulfilled effortlessly. Characters stop being symbols when politics presses on them. Padme Amidala is not merely a queen or senator. She is a woman watching democracy erode through votes she cannot prevent. Her tragedy is quiet, legal, polite. She loses not in battle but in committee rooms. Politics gives her room to breathe and to break. It transforms her from archetype into casualty of systemic shift. And that casualty resonates more deeply than a fallen warrior ever could. When Star Wars leans into politics, it stops being escapism alone. It becomes cautionary tale. It asks how freedom dies. It examines how institutions justify compromise. It interrogates how fear reshapes priorities. The famous line about liberty dying with thunderous applause lingers because it reflects something recognizable. Democracies do not always fall to invasion. Sometimes they dissolve through comfort, crisis, and consent. And that truth echoes beyond a galaxy far, far away. The myth works because it intertwines with machinery. The Force provides emotional and spiritual stakes. Politics provides structural stakes. Together they create tension that feels real. When institutions rot, heroes must navigate systems rather than simply defeat villains. When governance matters, choices ripple outward. And when ripple effects are felt across entire populations, the fantasy acquires gravity. Star Wars warns that power is rarely seized in darkness alone. It is often handed over in daylight, signed into law, rationalized as temporary, accepted as necessary. The lightsaber duel may conclude a conflict, but the policy vote initiates it. The hero's arc may inspire, but the institution's arc determines scale. And when both arcs collide, the saga transcends spectacle. It becomes reflection. That is why political Star Wars endures, not because it lectures, but because it mirrors. It asks audiences to consider how systems decay, how leaders exploit fear, how institutions compromise. It reminds us that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it drafts legislation, and sometimes the applause is louder than the warning. If political Star Wars is the saga at its sharpest, then the future of the franchise depends on whether it is willing to lean further into that discomfort. Because once you understand that institutions are the true battlefield, you can no longer retreat into simple binaries of light and dark. You have to ask harder questions. Not who swings the blade, but who drafts the law. Not who fires the superweapon, but who authorizes its funding. And that is where the myth matures. Future storytelling can deepen this by showing governance not as backdrop, but as catalyst. Imagine a galaxy rebuilding after Empire, where well-intentioned leaders slowly replicate the same centralizations they once opposed. Reconstruction is fertile ground for compromise. Emergency measures justified by chaos linger longer than intended. Systems desperate for stability demand swift authority. The tension would not lie in obvious villainy, but in incremental concession. The tragedy would not be explosive. It would be procedural. One of the most powerful directions Star Wars can pursue is exploring how heroes adapt once they inherit institutions. It is easy to resist tyranny. It is far harder to govern ethically. When rebels become administrators, they face trade-offs once condemned from afar. How much surveillance is acceptable to prevent insurgency? How much secrecy is justified to preserve unity? The very tools used against Empire become tempting when responsibility shifts. That is where moral storytelling transcends nostalgia. Political depth also allows antagonists to evolve beyond caricature. The next great villain need not build another Death Star. They might instead argue convincingly for necessary reform that erodes freedom subtly. They might campaign on restoring order after years of instability. They might champion economic recovery while consolidating oversight quietly. The most unsettling threats are those that feel reasonable. That is what made Palpatine enduring. He did not promise destruction. He promised stability. This direction would also reshape how the Force is portrayed. Instead of prophecy driving destiny, Force sensitivity could become entangled with civic responsibility. What does it mean for a Force user to serve within democratic institutions without overpowering them? Can someone with near-mythic ability operate ethically inside fragile systems? The tension between spiritual insight and political humility offers narrative richness rarely fully explored. Power does not only corrupt morally, it distorts process. The Jedi's future becomes especially compelling in this political lens. If they return as guardians after Empire, how do they avoid becoming unelected arbiters of policy again? Do they remain independent observers? Do they embed within governance cautiously? Or do they create mechanisms of accountability for themselves? The Order's greatest weakness was not lack of power, it was lack of transparency. Exploring that evolution would ground their mysticism in institutional realism. Similarly, rebellion stories can mature by focusing less on explosive heroics and more on coalition building. Resistance movements are rarely unified. They are messy alliances of conflicting agendas. Showing ideological disagreements within resistance adds texture. It humanizes struggle. It prevents romanticization. When viewers witness the cost of maintaining unity against oppression, hope feels earned rather than inherited. Perhaps the most resonant political storytelling comes from examining public complicity. Democracies do not collapse solely because leaders overreach. They collapse because citizens grow tired, fearful, distracted. Stories that follow ordinary individuals navigating expanding surveillance, censorship, or propaganda would deepen the saga's relevance. The Empire is terrifying, not only because of its rulers, but because of how many systems adapted to it willingly. Exploring that adaptation transforms myth into mirror. The line about liberty dying with thunderous applause endures because it reflects a universal anxiety. The future of Star Wars can expand on that by depicting applause in its quieter forms. Votes cast for stability, policies passed for security, silence maintained for comfort. The erosion of freedom rarely feels catastrophic in the moment. It feels reasonable. Showing characters wrestling with that reasonableness strengthens the saga's warning. Even hope benefits from political realism. Hope is not naive optimism in a political galaxy. It is resilience within systems that incentivize surrender. When characters choose to speak despite legal risk, when they organize despite surveillance, when they vote despite manipulation, hope becomes civic courage rather than destiny fulfilled. That shift grounds the Force's spiritual symbolism in lived human experience. Star Wars endures because it balances mythic archetype with institutional critique. The lightsaber duel resolves personal conflict. The Senate vote shapes societal consequence. The future of the franchise thrives when both layers intertwine, when victories on the battlefield cannot fully resolve tensions within governance, when triumph over a villain does not guarantee institutional health. That is where storytelling matures without losing wonder. The galaxy far, far away is compelling not because it escapes reality, but because it refracts it. Empires rise through fear. Democracies erode through comfort. Guardians become compromised when they entwine with power. Rebels struggle to govern ethically once they succeed. These are not simply fictional arcs. They are reflections of cycles that echo across history. When Star Wars leans into that resonance, it transcends spectacle and becomes reflection. The political dimension does not diminish the fantasy. It dignifies it. It gives weight to every blaster shot and every whispered speech. It ensures that when a hero ignites a lightsaber, we understand not only the enemy are before them, but the system behind that enemy. And when institutions shift quietly, we feel the tremor even without explosion. That is the future, where Star Wars remains timeless. Not as escape, but a story that warns, questions, and challenges as much as it entertains.